But I also want to convince you another thing. I want to convince you that it's less important to know who you are than it is to know what you are. Now you might think, wait a minute, I know what I am. I'm a human. But do you really know what you are? I've been a member of the TED community for 20 plus years, and it's been an interesting space to be in. I had to sort of find my way in because you have to be qualified to belong. And one of my friends who was a scientist artist came to me years before there were TED Talks and said, you need to get into this community. And I said, what is it? It's called TED. It's the brightest minds in the world coming together to share ideas worth spreading. And so I applied, and they said no. I guess I wasn't qualified. And so I wasn't discouraged. I applied a second time. I changed my story, told different aspects of my past, left out a few things. I'm a writer. And the second time, I thought my story was far more compelling, and they said no again. But I wasn't discouraged because I used to date, and so I'm used to rejection, and I understand that there's a fine line between persistence and being a stalker. And so then I heard about this event in Arusha, Tanzania. It was called TED Global. And I thought to myself, fewer people will apply for TED in Africa. And if there are fewer people, I might be more compelling to them. And so I applied to go to Arusha, Tanzania, and it worked. You see, I'm Latino. You can lock your door, but there is a window. And I'm coming in one way or the other. And I've learned all my life how to get to the top floor without being invited into the building. And so I finally was accepted to Arusha. My wife said, well, how are you going to get there now? I said, I'll find a way. And I went to South Africa, and when I got to South Africa to go into Tanzania, they had a sign that said, outbreak of yellow fever in Tanzania. Do not enter Tanzania without the vaccinations. You can go in, but you cannot come back out. That's next week's problem. So I went ahead and went into Tanzania. They lost my clothes. Here I am at TED with no clothes, no vaccination. I'm terrified. Have you ever been in a room you knew you did not belong into? I was like, that was me. I'm like, they're going to know really quickly that I do not belong in this room. And so I'm getting ready to go to the first event, and this friend of mine who's a fashion designer, and I design clothes, but he designs different clothes. He loves clothes that looks like saran wrap. And so he said, I got clothes for you, and he brought it to me, and I couldn't wear any of it because my body, it doesn't really need to be exposed or revealed. And I need loose clothes. And so I go to the first event. My son and my daughter are on the phone with me because I'm an extreme social introvert, and they're trying to coach me. It's terrible when your kids become adults and they coach you. And my son goes, Dad, don't go stay in the corner. Find people to talk to. My daughter's like, Dad, I need you to walk to the middle of the room and make eye contact. I said, but eye contact's tricky. Too little, it doesn't help. Too much, it doesn't help. And they said, look, my daughter said, look for someone who needs a friend more than you do. So I picked a different strategy. I said, I'm going to look for the kindest person in the room because they won't be able to say no when I say, would you like to talk? And I found this woman. She was older than me, the only person there older than me. And we got in line at the same time, and I said, hi, I'm Erwin. She told me her name. And then I said, this is my first TED. Is this your first TED? She goes, yeah, this is my first TED. And I said, do you have anyone to have lunch with? She goes, no. And so right away, I had human contact. It was so exciting. And then we sat at a table that was circular and held like 10 people. And we sat there and we talked for like an hour. And everyone else, 8 other people sat with us instantly. I thought, wow, this is amazing. People want to know me. But it wasn't really me, it was her. And they just listened for an entire hour. They thought we were best friends. But have you ever talked to someone who all they talked about was whatever they wanted to talk about, no matter what you talked about? You know what I'm talking about? You know? And so no matter what I talked about, she would talk about chimpanzees. And I said, you know, I was trying to be interesting. I said, I'm really concerned about the political situation in China. And she goes, oh, you know, chimpanzees have political dynamics as well. And I go, oh, I didn't know. And then I said, well, you know, and I started talking about the family system, the structure of families in the modern world. She goes, chimpanzees have family structures. And I said, oh, and no matter what I talked about, and I had about 5 minutes of chimpanzee information. That was it. After that, I was done. And after about an hour, I looked at her and I said, Jane, can I ask you a question? And because I thought to myself, there are only 2 women in the world who could know this much about chimpanzees, and they're both named Jane. One was married to Tarzan, and I don't think this was her. And the other is Jane Goodall. And so I said, are you Jane Goodall? And she goes, well, of course I am. And I said, well, that explains the entire chimpanzee thing. And then 20 years of TED, every single time I met someone, they were an expert in a species. Except for me. And I went home finally one time and I said to my wife, I cannot go back without a species. I need a species, and everyone has one. And I thought, is there a species I've accidentally studied or developed some knowledge of? And then it occurred to me, I've been studying humans all of my life. And I've been one almost all of my life. And because see, when I was around 10 years old, I came to a personal theory of reality. Because I didn't fit into the world. I felt alone and disconnected, and I just couldn't make this humanity thing work. And so I would run away. First it was through sleepwalking. They would find me walking the streets of El Salvador, unconscious and asleep. But I would always know what I was doing. I was searching for this place called home. I had convinced myself that I was from another planet, and they had placed me on Earth as an experiment to see if our species could integrate with your species. But I would disappear to fields at night, and I would scream to the stars, it's not working. Don't come here. We don't need to be here. Take me home. And I know it seems insane, and as I say it, it does seem insane. But you see, we humans are really good at creating stories that explain the pain that we carry, the experiences that we face, and the memories that shape us. But what I came to realize is that being human is an incredibly challenging process. Do you realize we're the only species that doesn't know how to be the species? That's what therapy is. All right, you see, there are no other species in therapy. I mean, if there are species that should be in therapy, it should be like zebras. What am I? It's like, where do I fall on the racial issues? I mean, platypuses, like, they should have, like, deep psychological trauma. No one knows who I am. I don't know who I am. You see, human beings are the only species that have really no clear intention about what it means to be human. And by the way, that's why you experience depression. See, you could not be depressed if who you are as a human being matched your ideal of who you are as a human being. See, the reason we struggle with depression and despair and anxiety and stress is because our reality does not match our imagination. What we're experiencing in the real world doesn't match the ideal that we experience in our inner world. And so I think it's really important to understand what it means to be human, because somewhere along the way, we have decided without intention to be less than human. Our language betrays us. Have you ever thought to yourself that was just absolutely inhuman? An act of inhumanity. We know that. We see that in violence all around us all the time. And we do think to ourselves that that's just inhumane. But have you ever watched National Geographics? Have you ever seen the way a killer whale plays with a seal as it tosses it in the air and it swims away and it grabs it one more time, throws it and it flies and tosses it and it swims away, and eventually they're playing tag. The seal doesn't want to play, but they're playing tag, and when the seal no longer has the energy to swim away, then that's when the killer whale eats it. And we never think to ourselves, that's inanimal. When we see a tiger hunt down a gazelle and tear its throat out, we don't think to ourselves, that's an act of moral evil. We just think that's nature. And yet humans know that our actions can actually be beneath the intention of our species. We can do things that are inhumane. So what does it actually mean to be human? That's what kept resonating in my soul, this question after TED after TED after TED and speaker after speaker after speaker. And they always had a species that they felt was invaluable, but I started wondering if anyone thought humans mattered. And in fact, when we talk about all the problems in the world, they seem to always pare down to us not knowing how to be the best expression of our species. It's sort of a contrast because we humans can imagine such extraordinary things and can commit such unthinkable acts at the same time. So what does it look like to be truly and fully human? I've been studying species for decades, and I've always been fascinated with how some species just so naturally, inherently do what they do. I mean, silkworms create silk. I'm a fashion designer, and I always thought it would be interesting if a silkworm woke up one day and said, I'm going to make a polyester blend. But it doesn't happen. Silkworms have an intention, and they fulfill that intention. In fact, beavers create dams. They have one career choice all their lives, from generation to generation to generation. I mean, can you imagine being a beaver and you have one choice? You get to build dams. I just think it would be incredible one day to go out into the woods or wherever beavers live and see a bunch of beavers making a dam, and then one hipster beaver making a bridge. Right? Wouldn't it be incredible? Right? You just hear the whole internal conversation. I told you you coddled him. Right? So I'm thinking, it's just a stage. It's just a stage. He'll come back. He'll build dams with us one day. And it's like grandfather beaver saying, that's the worst dam I've ever seen. But beavers cannot rethink their lives. They cannot rethink their intention. They cannot rethink their identity. But human beings can. See, no matter what you are right now, you can imagine a different you. You can imagine a different life. You can imagine a different future. And no matter what else you do in your life to try to find fulfillment, satisfaction, happiness, the further away your reality is from the life you imagine for yourself, the more tension, the more dissatisfaction, the more unhappiness, the more depression you will feel. So what is it that makes humans different than every other species? This is what I think is amazing. Humans have a superpower that no other species have. Humans materialize the invisible. You may not even know that about yourself, but in the same way that bees create hives and ants create colonies, humans create futures. It's so inherent to who we are that you don't even know that you're doing it. You think the future is something you're stepping into, something you're reacting to, but you're not. The future is something you're acting out. I mean, have you ever wondered where the first was? Like the first person to harness fire, or the first person to play a note on a flute, or the first person to invent the wheel. I've always wondered where things come from, but the most fascinating thing to me is when you ask the question, where does the future come from? See, most of us work with this mythology that the future comes from out there, and then we have to engage it. But the future actually comes from in here, and you have to create it. The future is created by the choices we make. That should excite you more. Because so many of us live passive lives, apathetic lives, lives without intention because we think it's someone else's job to create the future we long for. But it's actually no one else's job to create the future that you wish you had. Because the future you and the future life and the future world that only you can imagine can only be created if you act. Human beings have this creative capacity that no other species can. You can imagine a world that does not exist and create it. In fact, the reality is that most of us think the imagination is some ethereal space, but it's not. The imagination is in the practical, tangible reality of this space that we're in right now. Do you realize when you walked into this place, you didn't just walk into a building, you walked into the imagination of someone who saw it first and then designed it and then they built it. See, everything you do, everywhere you go, you're walking into someone's imagination. When Martin Luther King Jr. said, I have a dream that one day a man might be measured by not the color of his skin, but the content of his character. When Barack Obama was sworn in as president of the United States, he was literally walking through the dream of MLK Jr. And what we need to realize is that a part of the dynamic of your life is that you're living in someone else's imagination. And most of us, because we're so passive in our engagement of our greatest capacity to create, we live inside of someone else's nightmare while we long for our dream. See, the question is not, can you create? You're designed to create. You're going to create whether you know it or not, whether you like it or not, whether you mean to or not. The question is not, can you create? The question is, what will you create?